Thanks for joining us, Margaret. We will get started here in just a couple minutes.
Hi, Margaret. Welcome.
Looks like we're getting a couple more folks for you, Anita.
Absolutely. Hi, Kelly and Tara. Welcome, welcome on this beautiful, almost Memorial Day. Hi, Frank Smith. What a treat. And Frank, we need to have a conversation, so give me a call later today. Hi, Kelly. Hey. Brian Markham. Yes. I'm thrilled to hear and see your name.
So it looks like we are pretty close to get started time, so I will just run a couple of housekeeping details. The first thing, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box, and you can send them to either Anita or myself as the host, and then we'll make sure Anita has that information for the end of the session to answer questions. If you have any technical problems within the session, send a message to me at the host down in your list of options at the bottom of the chat box, and we will help you work through those. The webinar, as always, is being recorded and will be available in a few days' time. So obviously you guys will get to see it today, but it will also be available and you'll be able to play it back or review it at your convenience next week. And so that's all the little details I have. Anita, we will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie, and welcome to all of you. And you know, this is our last explicit instruction webinar for the year, and I've enjoyed them very much. And I just really wanted to, before we even start, talk about what's occurring in terms of explicit instruction this summer and next year. So you were involved in our great training in Portland. And we are going to, again, have parallel training this summer. And I'm revising the handout, so you might want to, like in late July, go back to the website, check out handouts. Maybe one of the revisions will be useful for you. And then we are starting the webinar, the 4 webinars again next year. And, of course, you'll be invited. So your participation in this doesn't end today. So this was interesting because the last webinar, I got many questions after the webinar, both in my conversations with some of the trainers and emails from them. So on that first page today, you see what our agenda is. We started on writing instruction and how it related to the Common Core, and then, but we didn't finish it. So we're going to go back through and finish that and the questions that individuals emailed me or when we were in conversation asked about. And then I've had some other trainer questions, totally unrelated to writing, so I'm going to respond to those. And then at the end, notice it says your questions. So I expect you to be putting in some questions that we can respond to on this beautiful Thursday. Actually, it's overcast and raining and cloudy in Portland, but you know, people who live in Portlandia quite love that weather. So one last thing to get in. A number of you emailed and said, you know, many of our administrators would benefit from the kind of view that you have been conveying to us in terms of the Common Core. And so I want to tell you that on the 6th of June, I'm going to do a webinar for Sopris Learning. And it's open to everyone. This one is particularly designed for trainers of explicit instruction. So you can go to the Sopris Learning website and register for that, or have whoever that you might want to sign up for it. Well, let's get started, because we were looking particularly at writing, and we're going to do a ever so quick review of what we covered, and then we're going to stop, and you'll see in red questions that people sent me. We were looking at what would be sort of the big ideas that we as explicit instruction trainers would want to convey and work with on our staff. And so one was that just like in reading, the foundation skills are absolutely critical to students being able to gain writing. And so you had a little visual of, well, what are those foundation skills? And it is true that we cannot set either in reading or in writing aside the foundation skills. In reading, particularly in K1-2, we have to have really good foundations instruction so that the students can meet all of the higher order goals that are in the Common Core. Same thing with writing, that the students have to have handwriting, they have to have spelling, they have to have grammar and capitalization, punctuation, they have to have ideas. All of those supports those foundation skills. It is important to focus in on a small number of genres. And we went through the fact that in the Common Core, there's arguments, informational text, and narrative. But I want you just to look at just a little note I made under informational text. If the students are going to, as the Common Core requests, to write often, and sometimes things that are long, sometimes things that are short, one of the most useful things we can do is teach children some genre that they could use in all subject areas that are rather short. And two that I find particularly helpful is if we can teach them to write summaries, then we can infuse that. Write a summary of this section of science, write a summary of this social studies, summary of this narrative story. And then second is compare and contrast. If we teach that at the beginning of the year, then we can compare two characters in English, we can compare two eras in social studies, we can compare prokaryote and eukaryote cells in biology. So those two I emphasize because it would allow us to have ongoing writing that would also promote comprehension. Well, and one of the big messages is writing is not taught, writing is taught, and that children really benefit from instruction. I'll never forget reading an article that was looking at a high school in New York City that had begun to very explicitly teach writing and how much it turned around the writing. It was last September in Atlantic Monthly. And I'll never forget one of the high school kids they interviewed, and she said, you know, when you are writing a paragraph and you have an example, you could introduce it by saying, one example is, or for example. No one ever told me that, but finally someone taught it. You know, and that is the point here, is that instruction is going to make a difference, where I model how to add transition words. Then together we look at paragraphs and add transition words. And then you take your paragraphs and add transition words. It's that same wonderful instruction. I do it, we do it, you do it. And that the students, one of our suggestions was that the students write many products. And, you know, I just have to emphasize this because, again, I had the gift of looking at a unit, an agency's units that they had written for teachers. And in it, they wrote one argument, one narrative, one informational report. And the problem with that is that you're not going to become masterful. So they have to be writing more products. Now, at the bottom here, I made the comment that we should have these products also written, particularly in the secondary level, in other content areas. So one of you wrote to me and said, how can we facilitate having more writing in content area classes? Well, the tact I would take would be to introduce at the secondary level English teachers, because their area is teaching writing genre, to introduce some genre that would generalize, how to write a summary, how to write a compare and contrast, and then introduce those at faculty meetings to the science and the social studies and the health teachers so that they could then incorporate them into their classes. I think my experience with secondary teachers is that they are very open to doing things that make a difference, but often it's just not a part of the informational that they have. So introducing it first in English classes and then generalizing it to those other classes. Well, another that we talked about is feedback. And I have to tell you, again, as I was traveling this week, I was reading articles about the importance of feedback and all the different ways we could give it. And what normally happens now is you write something, and then maybe 2 or 3 weeks later you get it back, and there's feedback on it. And you don't even read the feedback, you just look for the grade. So we have to look for very creative ways to give kids lots of feedback on their writing. So I had a list here of different options. And again, the first one is the one I would particularly want to emphasize, and that is when the students are writing that the teacher is circulating, just as we do in explicit instruction, where we walk around, look around, talk around, and we give feedback in real time. You know, that's where it makes the difference. You know, I was thinking about this evening, I'm going to cook a meal for friends, and I'm going to have one of my best friends here who is a culinary expert, and she's going to be right there saying, no, Anita, I think that more of this spice will do. That immediate feedback will be much more helpful than when I sit down all my guests and they say, something's a little off here. So delayed feedback just is not as useful as that immediate feedback where I could make changes right away. And that's why we need so much feedback in real time. Teachers could watch what's occurring as they monitor and then give feedback to the whole group, which I think is very powerful because often the challenges are repeated in more than one student. And the students could, of course, check their work against a rubric or certain attributes. Their peers could do the same. Their peers could look at their paper against a certain attribute or part of the rubric. The teacher could give feedback on a portion of the rubric, and the teacher could also give feedback on final drafts. So there's many ways to get feedback. but it is that feedback that is going to improve the quality of writing. So here was a question I got, and that was, should the same rubric be used across classes and across grades? Well, you know, if what I see across our nation is states are developing rubrics, school districts are having rubrics, agencies are having rubrics, but it would be useful if I was a 7th grader and I was asked to write an argument in English class, and then later in the year I was writing an argument in social studies, that the same attributes would be attended to. And so having rubrics that would be consistent from class to class would certainly make it even a stronger intervention for children. Now, if we make those rubrics related to the Common Core, and we look at what they suggest and incorporate that in the rubric, there would be some gradual changes from grade level to grade level to grade level in those rubrics. But still across one grade, different classes, it would be highly useful to have similar, if not exactly the same rubrics used. Those different teachers might put more weight on certain attributes on the rubric. So yes, that would take it to a new place where we were looking at some common views of what would make a good argument or a good informational text. Okay, so continuing our review, and I had 3 weeks ago an opportunity to teach writing, and I was again struck by the students and their response. I said, we're going to write an essay, we're going to write this essay together. It was like a wave of, you know, writing sometimes gets that response because it takes so much energy and so much focus. So I had to work hard to set the kids up for success. Luckily, I picked a topic of some interest, and they had a choice in terms of exactly which, it would happen to be an argument if they were going to write pro or con, but we do have to consider motivation. So that's about how far we got with totality, so I'm going to slow down and cover some of the other suggestions in more detail. One thing that we know about teaching writing is that there's 2 segments of the instruction. One is to teach children first what is the written product, where we introduce a rubric, we introduce an example that goes with the rubric. So here was the question right after our last session. How can we develop appropriate rubrics? Well, first of all, if I was a teacher, administrator today, I would use all of the electronic resources available. It's amazing when you put in something like rubric argument on our favorite Google, how many will come up, where states have developed them, agencies have developed them, teachers have developed them. So I would use all those resources to come up with the kind of wording that I wanted to use. Then I would look directly at the descriptions of each of the genre, narrative, informational text, argument, and be certain that I'm covering what was listed within those descriptions by grade level in the Common Core. And so, for example, I looked at 7th grade argument and looked at, well, what does the Common Core suggest? And so, for example, in the 7th grade, that the introduction would tell you claim, and it might acknowledge that there are counter-arguments, and it would organize the reasons. And then in the body, there would be support for the claims and the counterclaims, with logical reasoning, relevant evidence, and as the students wrote the body, there would be transition words that would allow some fluidity in the writing. And then there would be a definite conclusion, and it could be short, and that it would support the argument. And then overall, and then this is where some of our kids would have a challenge, that it's a reasoned, logical argument in a formal, not a conversational English, but a formal style, has very coherent writing. Right there's where some seventh graders would have difficulty and avoid plagiarism, and then has all of the conventions. So we can take this and make it into a student-friendly rubric that could really guide the student's writing. So looking at what is available, looking at the Common Core, and looking at having something consistent that teachers at a grade level would all be using so that the students would see the same one across subject areas. So the next suggestion is teaching the writing process. And it is interesting that if you look at the standards, that there's actually standards that look at the writing process, which is somewhat interesting because most standards are simply the outcome, not the process that would get you there. But they actually list, and it grows over time across the grade levels, but the process that students should be taught. So on the left-hand side, you see how it's worded, but even simple things like, look at the right-hand side, same steps, but simplified language. And you know that simplified language makes a big difference. I'm going to plan, I'm going to write, I'm going to revise, I'm going to edit, I'm going to rewrite. So we would look at each of these steps and what could we do? Questions would we really focus on with our teachers? So let's look at the planning part. And this is right where we didn't have enough time, though I introduced a few things. If we were going to look at the task of writing, and the task is here, and our students are here. This is a call for scaffolding that would lift them up and then gradually fading out that scaffolding. And so when we look at the research here, there's basically three major ways to scaffold the organization of what you're writing as you plan so that it can then be faded out. So let's look at each of those. One was writing frames, and I sort of slipped that in at the end of our last webinar. But they are extraordinarily useful. And so here we have just some examples. If I am serving children, let's say in third grade, and I want them to write a summary of a story, a narrative, and I didn't give them any directive, this is what they might do. Well, first this happened, then 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 this happened, and then the teacher says, well, you know, your time's almost up, and they write down it. So, but we would like it to have some more information than that. And so a writing frame might be a very an excellent way to initially train kids to write a summary of that narrative that they read in their core program. So looking at yours, I'm just going to use the story that I used at third grade, and you can see how the students would fill this in and often recopy it as a summary of that narrative. So my summer vacation took place in Texas. The main character of this story was Wallace. His major problem was that he had to learn how to be a wrangler. Now, Wallace tried to solve this problem by carefully observing the other wranglers on the ranch. In the end, he was such a good wrangler that he was able to stop the stampede. Now, notice that this is very different. This is the kind of summary that's a synopsis that tells us the main character, the setting, the problems, and how they tried to resolve the problem and what happened in the end. And if we did this, 1 summary, 2 summaries, 3 summaries, 4, 5 summaries, 6 summaries, 7 summaries, more, the students would get the idea of how to write a summary, and we could gradually fade it out with a plan. Maybe after giving it to them for many, 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 many weeks, we put it up on a screen, and they can use that wording, or they could alter the wording. Maybe then we fade it all together and just say, be certain in your summary that you mentioned the main character, the setting, the problem, how they tried to resolve it, what happened in the end. So we have a plan always for figuring out the scaffolding. And I included some others, where we ended up, and some people emailed me and said, oh, I love those. So another type of summary is a sentence starter summary, meaning that every sentence that's going to be in the summary, we have a sentence starter, and then the students copy that and complete it. And these are ones that I have designed after looking at numerous studies on this for use in upper grades, intermediate, middle school, high school classes. You, I get a really positive response from the science and social studies and health teachers when they use this. So the students copy it and then they complete it. And I gave you an example there of a day that I was teaching Continental Drifts. And so you see the part that is not italics is what I copied. In this section of the chapter, a number of critical points were made about and then I added Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift. Tell you what this does too. It really supports higher order thinking because the students have to be able to complete each sentence. Thus, they really have to go back into the material, really think about it carefully. Let me know if you use that one and if it works well for you. And I also included last time one for prediction and gave an example of a class that I was teaching. I think it was the 3rd grade, and the same thing. We're reading, maybe it was 2nd, a story called Max Found 2 Sticks, a definite thriller. And so the students would copy the last thing that happened in the story was, and then they would add to it. I predict that Max, and they would add to it. I have a number of reasons. Look at this, though. There's another benefit here. Notice how we have stuffed in a lot of academic language that not all second graders are saying. Finally, well, I got an email saying, do you have any more of these? Yes. Do you have any more? So they'd be great in content area classes, going back to the one that was a summary. So this is one that's similar that we used for an opinion on something that you've read. Okay? And so again, it has sentence starters, and then the students add to it. So the example is actually from an 8th grade social studies book where the students had been reading about Andrew Jackson, who in all of his elections, his first election, he said that he could be the president of the common man. So the students had this statement, Jackson is president for the common man, and they had to say if they thought he really was or was not. So in this example, first sentence starter, many people believe that Andrew Jackson was the president of the common man, as he declared during the election. However, so there's a counter-argument right from the beginning. However, I believe that Andrew Jackson was not the president for the common man, but rather the president for some of the people. And then one reason for my opinion is that you see how this would support not only writing that's formal, writing that utilizes academic language, but also the thinking skills of children. So if you develop any more of these, please send them to me because I think they are very useful and exactly the kind of support we need to give to content area teachers if we want them to continue working on writing in their own classes. So we could give kids actual frames to help them, or we could teach them a strategy. Now, last summer, in one of the examples, I shared with you a strategy for writing a paragraph that's informational or an argument. And that's another way to scaffold the kids, is to give them a systematic strategy. And this one, they would make a list that they want in their paragraph with the topic and details. They go back and cross out what they thought upon second reflection they didn't want to include. They would connect ideas that could go together. They'd number them, and then they would write. So I included an example here for those of you who are not familiar with this strategy that has proven to be extraordinarily effective. Of course, it has to be taught. We have to have that I do it, then we do it, and often we do it for quite a while. So let's do this together. Let's do it together. Then we gradually fade it out. Let's do it together. Let's do it together. And you do it. So the students have a topic and a list of details, and then they go through and cross out anything that's unnecessary or weak. Now, this happened to be a summary that we were writing about an article about the penguin bird. So they thought the details that were relevant, they crossed it out. And then they connected ideas that could go into one sentence that they could craft as a sentence. And after that, they would go back through and number the ideas and then write the paragraph. List, cross out, connect, and number. So we're not just asking kids to write. We're saying if the task is here and they're here, we're going to scaffold it. Maybe we're initially going to use writing frames. Maybe we're going to teach a summary. But the best research technique is to give them special graphic organizers. And there's the summary. Okay, so this is an example, and I'm sorry that the font size is so small, but one that was used to teach compare and contrast. Okay? And this came from the Bay Area writing project. So the students had a graphic organizer. And so they're thinking about how the St. Bernard and Newfoundlands are the same and how they are different. And they fill in the graphic organizer, and then they write a paragraph or two about how they're the same and a paragraph or two about how they're different. But I want to use this for a big idea. There are a lot of think sheets out there. Some of them are so complex that the students would never be able to generate them themselves. And we always have to have our mind on the future. So if I teach compare and contrast to students this way, maybe I teach it in language arts, and then the think sheet goes to the science teacher, and they use it there, and the social studies teacher, and the health teacher. But then the child moves to another school, and they have to do compare and contrast. We want it so that they could actually take the graphic organizer idea on a piece of paper, could make their own think sheet. Which here, it would be very easy. They make a 3-column T-chart and put same above it, category, and then what 2 things they're going to compare and the details underneath. Below it, another 3-column T-chart, and they have category and the 2 things they're going to compare and the details. This one, we could easily teach them how to generate themselves. And that is what we have to do. It's not just looking at teaching in the moment, but how we can take it so that they could use it in the future. Well, on the next page is one that comes from the work that I've done with Mary Gleason, author of so many, many years, a brilliant educator. And so we were teaching, and the students would read the prompt, and they would ask ask themselves, what's the topic here? Who is the audience? And what is the purpose? Remember, that is exactly the wording from the Common Core. And then they would decide, am I going to do pro or con? I always look at those words and am reminded of the need not to commit suicide. So one day I asked children in a writing lesson to write down what came to mind with the words pro and con. Pro basketball, pro baseball, con. Either you're in prison or you're just out. And it reminded me, let's not commit a suicide. Let's ensure that we actually teach them. Pro means that you are for it, that you agree with an issue. Con is you are against it, you disagree with it, that we actually teach the meaning of those terms. So if you look down below, just a simple think sheet. The students write down their claim, and notice the word claim. We used to talk about thesis statement, but the Common Core uses the word claim, so we'll use it too. Then we have some reasons for that claim, and then the support for those reasons underneath it. Students could easily, after they've used the think sheet for a number of arguments, they could generate their own. With the teacher modeling how to do that, maybe they put EAP at the top of the page so that they have topic, audience, and purpose. And then they write down the word claim, and then they make a T-chart with reason A and B and C and the details. So again, it is ensuring that we're teaching it, but also that they could generalize it. Well, this is a summary of those big ideas. Do you like the yellow? That's because that is the summer color, and it's coming upon us. And I know so many of you who signed in today that tomorrow's your last day of school. Some of you in different parts of the country go till end of June, but it's just a beautiful, bright, sunny color. But if we did all of these things, that basically are totally based on what we know about very good teaching, effective and efficient teaching, our children would become better writers. But all of these things need to be in place for that really to happen. Now, it is a time where I have had a chance to get many questions, and they're kind of random, but go with the flow here. So I typed in some of the questions that had come to me, and I'm waiting for your questions too. So these are all ones that people from last summer have sent to me or to our conversations have emerged. And so, first question is, interesting one that I got from one of our trainers who lives in a district where they're viewing the Common Core as a need for constant collaboration. Everything should be collaborative, it should be teamwork, it should be group think. And the question was, well, should that really be the case? And when I got that email, it just so happened that I was reading a book. One that would be a great summer read for you. And on the next slide, the book's called Quiet, and it is by Susan Cain, and it is actually about introverts. But even if you don't think you're an introvert, it's still a fascinating read. And in it, they talk about where collaboration would be critical or useful and where it would not be useful, and utilizes many stories about particularly creative geniuses and the fact that most of their creativity, most of their productivity emerged in a silo, not in group think. And as I read that book, I reflected on the books that I've written myself, the materials that I have worked on over my 47 years in this beautiful career. And the fact that there were times where collaboration, like with Dr. Mary Gleason, was critical, and then times where we were significantly more productive by working in our own silo, where we could put all of our focus, use all of our intelligence, all of our background knowledge, all of our creativity, and then come back together and get feedback, which led to changes. We have never tried to write a paragraph together. We have never tried to write a chapter together. And to be honest, I think that experience, which is replicated in the book Quiet, is one that we need to take at heart. I just was at a conference where a superintendent was talking about their goals of their whole district, actually it was the county office of ed, was collaboration and creativity. Well, collaboration and creativity. Look at Einstein, worked almost totally by himself. I don't know if these are necessarily totally linked together. Certainly hasn't been for me. So I just took an example here and to respond to this question of should all classwork involve collaboration and teamwork and groupthink? And my answer is no. Like most things, we better use it appropriately. So let's just look at an example. So the students are writing an argument. And before they go to write this article or argument, the teacher has taught them already how to write an argument essay, how to plan it, so that this example I'm giving here is not the first one. So they've already had instruction on writing it. And now we have an issue, and the teacher front loads it. The kids read articles about the issue. They talk about the issue. Because a number of studies in writing show that just like in reading, if we don't front load it, many children don't have any ideas. And so this wise teacher takes time to front load it through writing and discussions, maybe even debates. And then they are going to write either pro or con. Now here's a time where collaboration would be very useful, because you might have a really very good argument for pro or con that hasn't come to my mind yet. But in brainstorming reasons, possible reasons that we could incorporate into our essay, then the fact that we have group mind would be very helpful. At that point, it sort of ends for a while, because now I'm going to go out and I'm going to pick my pro or con, and I pick my major reasons, and now I'm going to go out and do research. It's very hard for me to do research with someone else because my mind goes on a different path than theirs. So I'm going to go do the research and get articles, get evidence that I can utilize. Then my team might get back together and I might say, I found this great article. Does anybody else want a copy of it because it might be useful to you? We could share resources. Would that not be a good point of collaboration? And then we go to write. Writing is such an individual task, taking all that's in my mind and putting it down on paper. I would just suggest that we understand that that's a silo task and that children are going to be doing that on their own. But then it's always useful to get feedback. I wasn't clear about this point. I don't know if this is a strong enough point. I think this is such a strong point, you should move it up to your first. Feedback would be whether it's feedback from a peer or feedback from a teacher or feedback from myself analyzing it. Feedback really benefits from input from others. And then I go back and I revise it. Again, a silo task. And I edit it for punctuation, capitalization. So let us not take the Common Core which says that children should learn collaboration skills. Well, absolutely, but not to the assumption that everything needs to be done collaboratively, because we have strong evidence in some of our greatest creative thinkers that much of their work was done in a silo. So everything needs to be asked, is it appropriate? Does it make a difference? And just because it's collaboration does not make it great. It needs to be in balance. It needs to be appropriate time for it. That's my thoughts, and I wish we were all together where we could have like a discussion of it, but I am very concerned where we can get off the mark and we will have some difficulties with the outcome of that. Well, I said these questions were not random. They just were coming from everybody's personal experience, so they might not be all in order, but I think they'll all be of interest to you. So another question that I got was, so we talked about a teaching a skill or strategy, and we could do I do it, and then we do it, and you do it. But in the instruction materials we have, they do you do it, then we do it, then you do it. Is there any challenge with that? Well, basically it sounds like that they are doing the you do it as sort of a little assessment to see if the students know it. And then they guide the students in doing it if they didn't, and then have them do it again on their own. And I suggested to this teacher that they might want, I could see this being appropriate where you were doing it truly as a assessment, but then to leave out modeling, that they might want to model it first before they do the we do it to set the kids up for success. But yes, you could do you do it as a form of assessment, but then you have to follow it by modeling we do it and you do it. Okay, well, here was our next question. And this was another one just looking at, well, is there another way of viewing some of the instructional routines provided in explicit instruction? And this question was, can you have students determine the meaning of a word by analyzing examples and non-examples versus telling them the meaning of the word and then applying it to the analysis of examples and non-examples? The answer is yes, you could. For example, in some of the research in math particularly, that model has been used. So let's go back to a lesson I taught not too long ago, a math lesson, where the students were learning acute and obtuse angles. Okay? Now I could have chosen to put up on the screen, let's say it's acute. I could have put examples of acute and non-examples, and then have the students determine what might be the attributes of an acute angle. Of course, an acute angle is an angle, and where two line segments intersect, it's also less than 90 degrees. So, from the examples, here's acute angles, here's not acute, they could have determined, okay, two lines intersect and it's less than 90 degrees. But here's what we always have to remember. There's some children out there that didn't get it right. And so if we had them analyze examples and non-examples to determine the critical attributes, we had better then directly teach it to ensure that everyone has the concept. So we could use it as feedback to them and then check their understanding with additional examples and non-examples. Why and why not? But if we just have them discover it and pray everybody gets it, that's the problem. So it is very appropriate to do if it's followed up with, let's see if you have all the attributes and then check your understanding. So, yes, we can if we teach to be sure everybody has it. Well, okay, this came out of the trainers that were with me when I was doing the math. And the question was, should you teach math vocabulary before the lesson or embed the vocabulary instruction as you proceed? Now, to me, this is a really important question, and because math isn't my major area, I looked up the studies on this very question, and the answer did not surprise me. So, for example, if I was teaching angles, and in the book that I was using in math, they actually embed the vocabulary as they're going, but as they're introducing the concept. So they had a picture of a putt-putt golf course and then introduced angles based on the angles that the players were doing in order to get the golf ball in the hole. Okay? The challenge with that is, think of all the things that you're thinking about. You've never done putt-putt golf, and then you're thinking about, well, angles embedded in it. The problem is, when it's embedded, we might have, and often do, could have cognitive overload. So the actual studies that I was able to locate on vocabulary shows that it was better to pre-teach the vocabulary, the most critical concepts, before you introduce the math lesson, so that when the students are looking at the example of the putt-putt golf course, they already have an idea of acute angle, and so that the cognitive overload is reduced. But to me, it was totally explainable why the kids did so much better with explicit instruction on the math vocabulary before they had it embedded in the examples given within the math book. Are you working on your questions? Because we're coming close to the end that you sent me. So one of our trainers who works at high school said, well, can't our students learn vocabulary independently at the high school? There are 3 studies I was able to locate where they did this very, very question. And one of them was interesting because it was actually a study, part of a dissertation that was out of Ohio State that utilized vocabulary instruction in the program Rewards Plus that I wrote with Mary Gleason and Vicki Vachon. So in the study, it used a single subject design, but so for one of the passages, the students were directly taught the vocabulary that was embedded in the passage, just exactly like we've talked about. Introduce the word, introduce the meaning, introduce examples, check for understanding. And then on the next passage, they had a independent practice where they located the word, they determined the meaning of the word and wrote it in a log, and they wrote examples of it. So it was totally independent instruction. And there were significant differences. The students had more retention when it was directly taught. Now, this would not mean that we shouldn't teach kids how to study vocabulary, so that we could give them practices for studying. But it appears that teaching of vocabulary is still a salient act that we could do even at the high school level. Okay, the last one was a big discussion with 3 trainers. One of them is online right now, about how do summer experiences affect the academic learning gap. And right after we had this discussion, I came home and just going to see if I put this in here. I came home and I picked up my educational leadership, which I highly recommend that you get. It's May's issue. I think it's May 2013 issue. And It is one I've read cover to cover, but the first 2 articles in it were particularly useful. And in it, they talk about how there is an academic learning gap today, and that it is not based on race, but based on income level. And that one of the major challenges is the differences in experiences for children during the summer between middle class and upper class homes and homes of poverty. That they are so different in terms of the richness of the experiences, the amount of read-alouds, the amount of reading that the kids do, that it accounts for much of the difference over time between children who are in higher income families and children of poverty. And it reinforced what I have seen over time, that we need to be certain that we are providing intense experiences during the summer so that we don't have this year lapse every summer, because it just increases the difference over time and makes it more difficult to close. So would you read that article? And you can just go online and buy 1 copy of May's. It certainly would be an excellent read for some of the schools that are participating today, some of the schools where we are serving to look at summer experiences as a way to, in addition to very good instruction that's effective and efficient, but what do we need to do during the summer so we don't have those losses? Well, here is the last question, and I received this one yesterday from one of our trainers who is involved in analyzing new core reading programs. And what should we consider? Well, my biggest suggestion here is that you do exactly what the Common Core does, and that as you look at it, it's an elementary supervisor that sent this question in, that you analyze programs separately, that you have, you look at programs that are very specifically designed to teach foundation skills in reading in K1 and 2. And that you look at those programs, and then you look at programs that are designed that the kids have been taught well. They've been taught those foundation skills well. They can read accurately and fluently. They have good vocabulary, and now they are going to extend those decoding skills and fluency skills, but they're going to add more complex text and comprehension. And looking at it as a dual adoption, because the foundation skill instruction in K1 and 2, as outlined in the foundation skills in the Common Core, would look different than in the upper grades. And I think that the districts that are going to do the best will be looking at a primary program such as Read Well, and then looking at a program that does an excellent job with information text, complex text for 3rd and above. Okay, well, I bet that I didn't see any questions come in, but I'm just going to sit here and hope that there are some. Jackie, did you have any questions?
Anita?
Yes.
There was one question sent earlier when you were talking about the framing and the writing, and it said, would you begin to make slight variations in the frames before beginning gradual release on the general type of frame?
Absolutely. You could, after you've used those frames, you could go with some students and talk about, well, what wording could we use here instead? What wording could we use here instead? It would be perfect. Absolutely. That's exactly what you might do. So the students would get an idea that this is not an absolute. It is a suggestion that we're using as we're learning it, but that the big idea is that you would have this kind of structure and you could use different kinds of words. That is like perfect. Excellent. have any other questions? If not, I'm just going to tell you how much I've enjoyed these webinars and how much I will enjoy seeing your names next year as we continue this. Because, you know, it's like anything else. If we really want to do it, we can't just do the diet and then go back to our old eating habits. We can't just do explicit instruction for a year and then say, done deal. No, we have got to continue to add to it, continue to use our best knowledge, continue to have it occur in every class, every day, bell to bell. And so it is my great joy to work with such really outstanding professionals across our country, a total joy. So may you continue to thrive as you go through your summer, as you read great books in terms of narrative and even greater books in terms of your knowledge level. And I will see you next fall. We will have our very first webinar in September. We'll give you a notification way in advance. And Jackie, I want to thank you, and I want to thank Safe and Civil Schools and Randy Sprick and Marilyn Sprick for allowing us to use your organization for these webinars. We're all very thankful for that. Have a great day.
No problem. Anita, thank you for your time and your wisdom that you're sharing with these folks who've attended your conference and will attend the upcoming conference. And we look forward to getting these folks all connected again next year for more of your brilliant insights.
All right. So keep sending me questions. You're always welcome to email me at archerteach@aol.com. Have a great weekend.